Good afternoon. I'm Jeff Cowan. I'm the Dean of the Annenberg School, and I want to welcome you all to the second annual event on religion, media, and Hollywood. The first event last year, for those of you who are here, dealt with the Passion of the Christ. And next year, our third annual event, which we're already planning for next spring, will deal with the Da Vinci Code. We're thrilled that tonight's event is co-sponsored by Diane Winston, who is our chair in Media and Religion in her program. The rest of you will be applauding by later in the afternoon as you see Diane, and also by our Center on Public Diplomacy. But we also have several other co-sponsors, and to make sure that I get them all mentioned, the School of Cinema Television, the School of Religion, the Center for Religion and Civic Culture, the Office of Religious Life, and the Tribeca Film Festival, which is finding its way west. And with that, I have been scripted by Diane to say, let the tape roll. What? Oh, I have to explain it? There is for those of you who've never seen these things, this is a trailer that you can get specially. That is going to be the beginning of a trailer, and now I'm going to say, let it roll.
I am Godfrey, the Baron of Iberland, your wise son. I have 100 men-at-arms in Jerusalem. Will you come with me?
I have done murder.
Haven't we all?
Is it true that in Jerusalem I can erase my sins?
We can find out together. Never use a low guard. Strike from high. What is this? You're all that survives me. Be without fear in the face of your enemies. Be brave and upright that God may love thee. Speak the truth, always, even if it leads to your death. Safeguard the helpless and do no wrong. That is your oath. And that's so you remember it.
Arise, the night.
You're your father's son. He was my friend. I'm yours.
You will protect the pilgrim road. All are welcome in Jerusalem, not only because it's expedient, but because it is right.
Whatever you ask, I will serve.
I was watching you today.
I was.
Born a servant.
You are a princess.
A woman in my place has two faces. One for the world, and one which she wears in private. With you, I'll be only Sibylla.
When the king is dead,
I will have the glory.
Give me all. That is what I do.
I go to pray. For what? For the strength to endure what is to come.
Saladin has crossed the Jordan with 200,000 men.
God be with you.
He's no longer with me.
What becomes of us?
The world will decide. The world always decides. They're here.
It is only one man.
No, they're here.
When will it begin?
Soon.
My lord, how are we to defend Jerusalem without knights?
You were born a servant. Kneel. Every man at arms, all capable of bearing them, kneel! Be without fear in the face of your enemies. Be brave and upright that God may love thee. Speak the truth, even if it leads to your death. Safeguard the helpless. That is your oath. And that is so you remember it. Rise a knight! Rise a knight!
Who do you think you are? Will you alter the world? Doesn't making a man a knight make him a better fighter?
Yes. It has fallen to us to defend this city. Not to protect these stones, but the people living within these walls.
What is Jerusalem worth?
Nothing. Everything.
Thank you all for coming here today. I'm Diane Winston, and I'm going to introduce the panelists to you. Our hope today is to throw a little light on the pretty hot movie, Kingdom of Heaven. Now, we had asked Fox, who was the studio that produced it, to send someone over to discuss it with us, and they refused to do that. However, we assembled a panel that can talk about the issues that the film raises, and some of you may have seen it or read enough about it to bring your own experiences to the discussion. Now, joining us today will be Ruvain Firestone, a professor of medieval Judaism and Islam and the director of the Edgar Magnin School of Graduate Studies at Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion in Los Angeles. Professor Firestone's specialties are Islam and its relationship with Jews and Judaism, scriptural interpretation of the Bible and Quran, and the phenomena of holy war. His books are Jihad, The Origin of Holy War in Islam, and it's his sequel, soon to be finished, Kiddush, The Revival of Holy War in Judaism. After we hear from Dr. Firestone, we have John Aberth, who is directly to my left. Dr. Aberth is an historian who lives in Roxbury, Vermont, and teaches at Vermont's Castleton State College. He's taught history at a number of other institutions, including Middlebury College, University of Vermont, and the University of Nebraska. He received his PhD in medieval history from Cambridge University in England and has published several books on the Middle Ages, including A Night, K-N-I-G-H-T, at the Movies, Medieval History on Film. I should have noted that as Dr. Firestone will be talking to us about Holy War, Dr. Aberth will be discussing depictions of the Middle Ages on film with us. Last but not least, we have Ayman Khalifa. Mr. Khalifa holds a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and Mass Communication from the American University in Cairo, and a Master's of Science in International Economic Development from the University of London School of Oriental and African Studies. He is currently head of media services with MID Foundation, a specialized multilingual localization and cultural consultancy firm, where he also serves as a cultural consultant on numerous film and television projects, and maintains a keen interest in the view from the other side. In other words, how Arab and Islamic media depictions misrepresent and stereotype Western and American civilization. And he will be discussing how a film like this manages to span the cultural divides of Western Christian and Muslim perspectives. Basically, the question I think we're going to be thinking about today is, how does Hollywood mediate between history and entertainment when they're making a big budget film like this? The film cost $130 million to make. It's obviously something Fox hopes will do very well. And yet, how do you get a film that's going to play all over the world in today's environment where religion and politics are hotly contested? Ruvain?
Hi. My mission, which I chose to accept, was to soften you up a bit on the issues of holy war before we actually begin the getting down to brass tacks and dealing with the film and what the issues of relationship between media and culture in America and media and culture in relation to what we're all doing here. I should mention that the name of the sequel book is going to be Kibush.
Okay.
Kiddush is like making kiddush, is making a blessing over the holiday for some Jewish holiday. Kibush means conquest in Hebrew, and so this is a study of the way in which some minority expressions of modern Judaism have kind of revived the concept of holy war in Judaism, which seems to be almost absurd given the history of the Jews, but anything is possible. When I speak to students and when I speak to groups, I often tell them that you should never believe anything I say, not only generally for its own sake, but because people have a tendency when discussing religion to make extraordinary statements that really have no basis in reality. Or they make statements that have some kind of basis in reality but are extremely interpretive, that are exegetical. So you want to go to the text to see where does this originate? What is the origin? What is the source of this, whatever conclusion is being made? And it generally, at least in the scriptural traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, or Judaisms, Christianities, and Islams, derives from some kind of a textual source, scripture or scripture interpretation. So I've given you some sources on a piece of paper for you to look at, not exactly at this moment, but in a moment. And we'll take a look at them. And I want to present for you some ideas about holy war as a phenomenon. I wrote this book, Jihad, The Origin of Holy War in Islam. And I must say, I don't claim credit for the title Jihad, although I take responsibility for it because I did agree to it. The original title was The Origin of Holy War in Islam, and the publisher said, well, it should be Jihad, The Origin of Holy War in Islam, otherwise it's not going to sell. So we did use that as a title, and it still didn't sell. No, it did fine. But some of my Muslim colleagues were upset with me in the academic world because they said, Reuven, you know that Islam does have a concept of jihad, but it doesn't mean holy war, and there is no such thing as holy war in Islam. There's no such thing as holy war in Islam. And as I spoke to some of my Jewish colleagues about my upcoming work on the revival of holy war in Judaism, some very learned people said to me, Reuven, you know that there's no concept of holy war in Judaism. And so I think it's worth defining what holy war really is. I mean, what does it mean? And why might one religious spokespersons of religious tradition say, we don't have it, but they do? And the answer is usually political, because ultimately, how do you define holy war? The concept holy war doesn't exist in Islam. It's not a concept. The name, holy war, al-harb al-muqaddasa, doesn't exist in Arabic. In Hebrew, aside from the very modern, sort of revived Hebrew that's been strongly influenced by Christianity in Europe, there is no concept, milchemet kodesh, in Judaism. But there certainly is an idea or concept of holy war in both religious systems. If you define holy war as I believe one must, and that is, holy war is any kind of mass violence directed to an outside polity, an outside group, defined however one defines outside, that's us and them, the other, as a communal cooperative entity, that is authorized in one way or another by God. Now, what does it mean to be authorized by God? I could say it's authorized by God, and you can say that's baloney, that's not authorized by God. So I need to, in some way, demonstrate to my community, the inner community, my own religious community, that God is in some way authorizing or commanding that we go out and fight another community of people. And that can be done in many ways historically. I'm just giving you a kind of overview. So in a multi-theistic environment, one can receive a sign from the gods that we must go out and fight these other guys, right? Could be the way that you cut open a pigeon and you see the color of the of the intestines. If it's green, you hit the bile. I shouldn't say hit the bile. That explains it. You see, green is a message from God of one particular. It's a yes/no question. Green means yes, go get him. Red means no, don't go get him. You see, it could be divine authorization through the aegis of a prophet or an oracle. It could be from text, that is, from the scripture, the revelation of God. It could be God, him or herself, who suddenly gives the command to a community of people that you should go out and fight these guys. Or more likely, it is the ways in which the Word of God, the divine and authoritative Word of God, is understood by Scripture, that is, the record of the divine revelation, is interpreted by authoritative interpreters of that Scripture to determine that God said yes or no, how one should go out and fight these other people. In other words, war is authorized by God. Doesn't mean, it doesn't give you what the goal, the immediate goal is. All it does is really talk about the authority for engaging in the conflict. Am I making any sense? Okay. Now, if one, in the histories of warfare that one reads, one learns that if there is such a thing as original in anything, if you were to take the idea of original war, or earliest expressions of fighting between one polity and another, let's sort of imagine, cave fighting, cave wars. How many people saw the great film? The dialogue was the best. Search, Quest for Fire. Really terrific dialogue there. The engagement between one clan or one cave clan with another cave clan was for purely material reasons. And war seems to be, if one can make such a general statement, seems to be a human option often for the gaining of material goods for the family, for the extended kinship group, the tribe, eventually perhaps one can say the nation. But at some point in history, over time, it was felt that just going after these other guys, just going out and fighting the other in order to claim their personal possessions, their homes, their land, their labor force, meaning their humans for slaves, their women for fertility, that wasn't a good enough reason. So there needs to be something else that can justify or authorize engagement with the other. And whether the reason is purely material gain, defense, whatever the reason might be, it seemed to have come into the consciousness of humanity virtually universally that there needs to be something beyond simple material possession that can authorize one to go to war. And that is the development, or that you could say the birth of what we would call in very general terms ideological warfare. Holy war, or war that is authorized by God, is one form of ideological warfare. There are other forms as well. Right? Could be just, an ideological reason would be social equality, the end of the first estate. It could be, I'm writing down here, I jotted down some notes, economic equality, the end of capitalist or bourgeois owners of production. It could be the end of foreign control of native peoples. These are all ideological reasons that provide a kind of authority. Perhaps the most powerful and most significant way of convincing a lot of people to go out and do something that you normally would not necessarily want to do is because the divinity commands it. Now we're going to take a look at your texts. And the purpose of providing text is simply to show you that, yes, holy war, as I define it, exists in the three scriptural traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. They all have it. The question is how one engages in these texts in order to justify actual engagement in holy war. I don't really want to take time from the others. I'll force you to read one example. I'll give you two examples from each scripture. We're going to look at one from each one. Let's take a look at Deuteronomy 7. I also tell my students, by the way, don't believe just the translation. Go to the original. Unfortunately, since I don't know Greek, I couldn't give you the original, really, of the New Testament, but I could deal with the original for the Hebrew Bible and the Quran. When the Lord your God brings you to the land that you're about to enter and possess, and God dislodges many nations before you, Hittites, Girgashites, Amorites, all of them being Canaanites, 7 nations much larger than you, and the Lord your God delivers them to you, and you defeat them, that's already a statement of holy war. God is going to deliver them to you, and you're going to defeat them. You must doom them to total destruction, grant them no terms, and show them no mercy. This is the destruction of every man, woman, and child. The word in Hebrew is aharem, taharim, otam. The word is harem, which is absolute and total, complete destruction. This is a command essentially for genocide against the Canaanite nations living in the land of Canaan. I always include the next line because it says not only should you absolutely destroy them, but you shouldn't intermarry with them either, which is a suggestion that perhaps this idea was an ideological statement rather than an actual command for policy. But whether it's an ideological statement or a command of policy, in the later generations, it really doesn't matter because it can be interpreted in one way or in the other. The New Testament, of course, was revealed in a period of time in which the receivers of the revelation were on the short end of the stick. They were on the wrong end of the stick. They were the ones being beaten rather than the ones who were doing the beating. And it's logical that in a situation like that, the revelations would be stressing of compassion rather than judgment. And you find that in the New Testament. Nevertheless, you do find a piece that's repeated once in Matthew and then repeated in Luke that I think speaks for itself. You must not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. I have come to set a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. It doesn't say a son against the mother-in-law. That was a joke. And a man will find his enemies under his own roof. No one is worthy of me who cares more for father or mother than for me. No one is worthy of me who cares more for son or daughter. No one is worthy of me who does not take up his cross and follow me. Whoever gains his life will lose it. Whoever loses his life for my sake will gain it. And finally, in the Quran, 2 verses which are known as the sword verses describe engagement of the other. One is in reference to what would be described as pre-Islamic idolatrous Arabs. The other one would be described as a military relationship between the new believing community and Jews and Christians and other peoples of the book, people who have scripture. The first one is clear. When the sacred months have passed, which is really not important for the purpose of this discussion, kill the idolaters wherever you find them, seize them, beset them, lie in ambush for them everywhere. That, by the way, is stated very prominently in Osama bin Laden's, one of his announcements and his fatwas, if you will. But he doesn't include the rest of the sentence, which is, if they repent and establish prayers and pay the zakat, set them free, God is forgiving and compassionate. And, of course, that's a reference which most of the overwhelming majority of the Muslim commentators of the Quran refer to pre-Islamic Arabs, not to Christians or not to the West in general. The next verse is in reference to Jews and Christians. Fight those, essentially, until they pay a poll tax and take on a secondary status in Islamic society. That was the way this verse was interpreted by Muslim commentators in the high period of Islam. And finally, we're not going to read this long last text, but I want this for you to ruminate over, and that is the record of the statement of Urban II that was recorded by Robert the monk, which you'll look in here as hard as you can, and you won't find any scriptural references. So when there's a will, there's a way. You can engage in holy war, defined as the authoritative spokesperson for the religious system, even in some cases where you don't have a readily available scriptural justification and authority for the statement. So I've given you a kind of the topic is worth a course or two over the semester, but hopefully we've given you a little bit of background so that we can make some sense or more sense from the following speakers. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to use the podium because I'm going to show some film clips, and I want to be able to see them too. Anyway, the title of my talk is God Wills It, Crusade History on Film. Shortly after the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, U.S. President George W. Bush characterized America's forthcoming response as a crusade. The president's use of the term was controversial because whether he realized it or not, can you hear me? Yeah. Because whether he realized it or not, crusade designates holy war between Christians and Muslims, which had its origin in heyday during the Middle Ages, and which many believe was soon realized by the president's decision to undertake a second invasion of Iraq in 2003. The Kingdom of Heaven is the first crusade film to bravely test the cinematic waters since the terrible relevance of these events. More narrowly defined, the Crusades referred to a series of armed expeditions undertaken by medieval Europeans between the late 11th and late 13th centuries, with the ostensible goal of conquering Jerusalem, holy to no less than 3 religions, in an act the perpetrators believed to be an imitation of Christ. Of all the Crusades launched by European Christians between 1095 and 1291, the Third Crusade of 1187-1192 is the one most favored by the cinema. There are any number of reasons for the popularity of the Third Crusade as a cinematic subject. The irresistibly romantic protagonist of Richard the Lionheart, King of England, and Saladin, Sultan of Egypt and Syria. The abundance of primary sources available for both sides, and the early entry of this event into popular culture with Sir Walter Scott's 1825 novel, The Talisman, the contributor of many plot elements to film. The Kingdom of Heaven adds yet another title to the growing list of films on the Third Crusade, although it takes a little different tack by focusing exclusively on events at the very beginning of the crusade, namely the battle at the Horns of Hattin on July 4th and the fall of Jerusalem to Saladin on October 2nd, 1187. I'm here to talk about some of the cinematic precursors to the Kingdom of Heaven that can perhaps inform the film and put it in context. One is a 1935 production from the master of the epic genre, Cecil B. DeMille, called The Crusades, starring Henry Wilcoxon as Richard and Ian Keith as Saladin. The second is a little-known 1963 production out of Egypt, which at the time had the largest film industry in the Arab world, called Saladin, directed by Yusuf Shaheen and starring Ahmed Mazar as Saladin. Both these films have a rather transparent political subtext. As I teach my students in my medieval movies class, these films are just as revealing for what they have to say about modern history around the time the film was made as for any genuine portrayal of the Middle Ages. To take the Crusades, this film was made at a time when the U.S. Congress passed the first of what was to be 4 neutrality laws designed to keep America out of any future European conflict. It was not even 2 decades since America's involvement in the most destructive war to date in human history, a world war that had thoroughly disillusioned an entire generation of survivors. As you watch this clip from the Crusades, listen to how the actress Loretta Young, who plays Berengaria of Navarre, Richard's wife, serves as the mouthpiece for the film's political message. The scene is set in Saladin's tent, where Berengaria is dressed as a houri in the Sultan's harem. And don't ask how she got there, it's complicated. And here she pleads with her husband to make peace with his Muslim adversary. So let's roll the tape.
Oh, Richard, you must believe. I've never loved anyone but you. I love you now. Don't make me suffer more. If only we could put an end to pain. If only we could have peace. If you fight on, thousands and thousands more will die. Richard, you mustn't.
You know how to yield to a conqueror. You think to teach me?
We've been blind. We were proud, dearest, when we took the cross. And in our pride, we fought to conquer Jerusalem. We tried to ride through blood to the holy place of God. But now we suffer.
The holy city of Allah.
Oh, what if we call him Allah or God? Shall men fight because they travel different roads to him? There's only one God. His cross is burned deep into our hearts. It's here, and we must carry it with us wherever we go. Oh, don't you see, Richard, there's only one way. Peace. Make peace between Christian and Saracen.
You asked me to lay down my sword.
If you love me.
Sultan, I offer you peace.
You ask for the truce of Allah?
Truce of Allah or peace of God, yes. I ask it for the crusade.
Upon what terms?
The gates of Jerusalem shall be opened, and all Christian captives shall be freed.
All Muslim captives in Akka shall be freed.
Every Christian shall be allowed to enter Jerusalem.
If they bear no arms.
Granted. They shall come in peace to the tomb and go in peace.
All but you. Lion of the Christians, the foe of Islam, you may not enter the gates.
I vowed to go to Jerusalem with my sword.
And I vowed you should never pass the gates of Jerusalem. I offer terms your sword could never win.
Richard, you hold a piece of the world in your hands. What does it matter what happens to us? If men can live and the holy city be freed.
Berengaria, you know what you ask.
Yes. We've come to our cross, beloved. We carry our love and the pain of it deep in our hearts.
Your terms are granted. It stands between us as man and wife. Forever. I make peace with you.
Let there be peace.
Well, indeed, peace is mentioned no less than 11 times in the entire scene. It is a peace that Richard's sword can never win, and his act of breaking it into pieces is surely symbolically significant. If thousands upon thousands could die during the Crusade, the First World War had demonstrated that millions upon millions could now do so. The strident anti-war message in the Crusades is all the more remarkable given that DeMille's only other medieval film, Joan the Woman, made in 1917 about the French heroine of the 100 Years' War, Joan of Arc, was a transparent propaganda piece that incited Americans to go to war on the Allied side in World War I. One only wonders what the Crusades would have looked like if it was made just 5 years later. Our second clip is from Saladin, and likewise betrays a strong political subtext. In this scene, Saladin comes virtually alone before the entire Christian crusading army in order to negotiate peace terms. Here, for the first time in the film, Saladin and King Richard meet face to face, which never happened in real life, but is exactly analogous to a scene from the Crusades and ultimately derives from Scott's Talisman. As you watch this scene, look for how Saladin presents himself to the assembled Crusade leaders, how he assigns responsibility for the war, and how he justifies his current occupation of Jerusalem. And I've edited the scene for the sake of brevity. So let's roll the tape.
جايب لي القواد والحرس.
بيستهزأ بينا.
السلام عليكم.
فيليب أوغست ملك فرنسا وقائد الجيوش الفرنسية.
كونراد دي مونفران. صلاح الدين عبد الله خادم العرب.
إن كنت تريد أن توفر على نفسك القتال فإليك شروطنا.
في أي شريعة يحق للمغتصب أن يفرض شروطه على صاحب الدار؟ أنتم جئتم إلى بلادنا معتدين، فإن كنتم حريصين على السلام حقا فاخرجوا من بلادنا.
معنى هذا أنك تعلن علينا الحرب.
أنا أكره الحرب، وتعاليم الإسلام والمسيحية تلعن سفك الدماء، ولكن إذا كتب علينا القتال دفاعا عن أرضنا فلا حيلة لنا إلا الحرب.
إننا كفرسان شرفاء لا نريد أن نستغل هزيمتك، وإنما نعرض عليك الصلح على أن ترد إلينا أورشليم وكل الإمارات الصليبية.
ولماذا نتنازل لكم عن أجزاء من وطننا العربي؟
خوفا على بلادك من الدمار وسوء المصير، وحرصا على حياتك أنت.
إذن هي الحرب، نخوضها دفاعا عن الحق والعدل.
أي حق وأي عدل؟
الملك ريتشارد الفارس الجسور، ريتشارد قلب الأسد، لو لم تأتي إلينا في موكب الغزاة لقلت لك مرحبا في بلادنا.
ولكن ريتشارد قلب الأسد لا يقبل الترحيب من رئيس عصابة تضطهد المسيحيين وتعبث بقبر ابن الرب وتغتصب المدينة المقدسة أورشليم.
من أدخل عليك أن صلاح الدين المؤمن بكل الأنبياء يعبث بقبر المسيح أو يضطهد أهل الكتاب؟ بيت المقدس بلد عربي، والأماكن المقدسة مفتوحة لكل الأديان.
الغريب أنك تدعي الشجاعة والصدق، ومع ذلك تنكر اضطهادك للمسيحيين، بينما يدك ما زالت ملوثة بدم القديس رينو.
ليس من الغريب على أرملة رينو السفاح أن تدعي أي شيء.
احترس إنك تخاطب سيدة.
من تقاليدنا احترام النساء، ولكني أخاطب المحاربة شركة رينو.
تظاهرك بالسماحة لا يغسل يدك من الدم المسيحي.
يتكلم عنا عيسى فهو مسيحي مثلكم، وهو من أبرع قوادي وأعز أصدقائي.
شعارنا الدين لله والوطن للجميع.
عميل من عملائه أغراه بالمال. كونراد يعرف من هم الذين يشترون بالمال، أما أنا فليس لي عملاء. أيها الملك ريتشارد، لآخر مرة أعرض عليك السلام حقنا للدماء.
وأنا لآخر مرة أعرض عليك إما التسليم من غير شرط وإما الحرب. الحرب!
هذا هو رأي الملك ريتشارد فارس الصليب، أيرفض السلام؟
ولكن الضمير المسيحي لا يطمئن ومدينة الزيتون في أيدي العربية.
ولكنكم تحرقون أغصان الزيتون.
Well, the film came out in 1963, less than a decade after one of the most dramatic events in modern Egyptian history, the Suez Crisis of 1956. The president of Egypt, an army colonel called Gamal Abdul Nasser, was one of the leaders behind a military coup that ousted the Khedive, King Farouk, in 1952 and set up a republic. As part of his modernization program for the country and bid for national independence from the European colonial powers, particularly Britain, Nasser, in July 1956, nationalized the Suez Canal, a vital waterway linking the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. In response, Britain, with the collaboration of France and Israel, invaded Egypt and seized the canal, while Israeli forces occupied the Sinai Peninsula. But by January 1957, all three aggressors were forced to disgorge their gains under pressure from the Eisenhower administration and the United Nations. It was a spectacular victory for Nasser, despite the complete failure of his military to defend his country, and one that he exploited in order to turn himself into a pan-Arab leader, which he partly realized when he became head of a unified Egypt and Syria, the United Arab Republic, in February 1958. Obviously, all this invited comparisons with Saladin, which Nasser duly made in his speeches. In the film, Jerusalem clearly stands in for the Suez Canal, a symbol of Arab dignity and pride in the Arab nation, which Saladin is merely trying to defend in the face of Western aggression, but which is entirely anachronistic in the context of the Middle Ages. What is most striking to me is how thoroughly secularized Saladin has become in this film. Notice how he introduces himself as the servant of God and of the Arabs, not as the servant of Islam. And this is in contrast to gold coins issued by Saladin in 1187, which describe him as, quote, the Sultan of Islam and the Muslims. Although the film devotes an elaborate set piece to the Battle of Hattin of July 4th, 1187, it omits entirely the siege and conquest of Jerusalem by October 2nd, which Saladin's contemporary Muslim biographers pointed to as the culmination of his career as a mujahid, or jihad fighter, and conclusive proof of his commitment to waging jihad against the infidel Christians. Nasser, for whom Saladin is obviously a stand-in, was trying to build a modern, secularized state in Egypt, following in the footsteps of his 19th century predecessor, Muhammad Ali, and of Kemal Ataturk in Turkey. But it is a vision that, like Saladin's much vaunted chivalry towards even his Christian opponents, seems out of favor in much of the Arab world today that has seen the resurgence of fundamentalist Islam. As an aside, you may have noticed the color schemes used for the Christian army at the start of the scene, which I think are politically significant. Blue for France, red for England, white for Israel. You may also have noticed how Virginia, Renaud's widow, is the designated slut of this film. This is because she violates Muslim purdah by not only being sexually active with all the bad guys in the film, but also she dares to fight and bear arms in a Hospitaller costume, which follows closely how Imad al-Din, Saladin's private secretary and author of one of the Muslim sources of the Third Crusade, describes his shock and dismay at the arrival of both female Christian crusaders and prostitutes at the siege of Acre in 1191. Finally, I'll brave some comments about Kingdom of Heaven. Although I haven't been able to preview the film, I've consulted an early draft of the script, as well as a member of the press who attended an advanced screening of the film here in LA. I have been struck by the continuities between Kingdom of Heaven and the earlier Crusade films. Like the Crusades, the new film features a siege set piece as its climax. Whether the target be Acre or Jerusalem, both involve flaming catapults, siege towers, boiling oil or heavy stones poured on the defenders, etc. Both films promote peace as the ultimate goal, the holy grail, if you will, of a new Latin kingdom. Despite effusive amounts of crowd-pleasing gore, like Saladin, Kingdom of Heaven wants to peddle an essentially secular Saladin. At one point in the new film, during negotiations for the surrender of Jerusalem, Balian of Ibelin, played by Orlando Bloom, threatens to burn Jerusalem to the ground, including both Muslim and Christian holy places. Everything, he says, that, quote, drives men mad. To which Saladin replies, quote, I wonder if it would not be better if you did. This would have had Saladin's contemporary Muslim biographers so anxious to portray him as the supreme mujahid out to reconquer Jerusalem for Islam, spinning in their graves. Just as Saladin wants to show Arabs as trustworthy and honorable guardians of Jerusalem, so native Christians under the leper king Baudouin IV are shown in Kingdom of Heaven as keepers of a place where, as Count Raymond tells Balian, quote, Jews, Christians, Muslims, All are welcome in this kingdom and all protected. Of course, Kingdom of Heaven also has its own agenda and message. What is remarkable to me is that the enemy in the film are not fanatical Muslim mullahs who receive very little screen time, but fanatical Christians. Not only do we get one unprovoked massacre of a Muslim caravan by the evil Renaud of Chatillon, we get two. In the second one, Renaud slays Saladin's sister, no less, and this completely justifies, in the audience's mind, not only Saladin's resumption of the war, but also his execution of Renaud after Hattin. At this point, I'd like to show a second clip from Saladin, which will provide an interesting contrast to what you will see in Kingdom of Heaven. Although the scene also shows Renaud and his henchmen attack an unarmed Muslim caravan, I guarantee that you will not see anything like this in Ridley Scott's film. The scene starts off with Renaud conspiring to attack the caravan over the objections of the old king of Jerusalem, who in reality was a rather younger Guy of Lusignan. So let's roll the tape. Well, within the space of 2 minutes, Shaheen has managed to violate almost every film editing rule in the book. Interestingly enough, the scene starts out with an example of continuity editing, the graphic match between the candelabra and the Muslim pilgrims in prayer, a standard transitional technique in the filmmaker's toolkit. But the scene quickly deconstructs the narrative through discontinuity editing, including graphic, rhythmic, spatial, and temporal discontinuities. And for example, graphic discontinuity is the contrast between two different images. At the most basic level, you see red and then white. And this is obviously designed to demonstrate a violation of Muslim purity, especially with the massacred female pilgrims. Rhythmic discontinuity is changing the tempo of the film. You may have noticed at the very end of the scene, it quickly speeds up. Spatial discontinuity is when Shaheen shows the horse's hooves swirling by on a 360-degree axis. Normally, filmmakers are taught to respect a 180-degree plane. And finally, temporal discontinuities is when you have no sense of the progression of events here. The massacre may take place over minutes. It could take place over hours. We don't know. Anyway, For good measure, Shaheen also throws in a non-diegetic insert, which is the Crusader's sword running with blood with a thick matte line around it. And also a violation of film frequency by which the same shot is not supposed to be shown twice. And this is the Crusader plundering the pilgrim treasury, which was shown several times. Shaheen, in portraying an atrocity committed upon the Arab world by the West, rather self-consciously rejects traditional Hollywood film techniques and seems to side with the montage style favored by the Soviet film industry under Sergei Eisenstein. Although the scene may seem rather clumsy and disorientating to our eyes, it is, I think, an impressive marriage of film technique and political message. Getting back to Kingdom of Heaven, Guy of Lusignan is now a bad guy who actually incites Renaud to attack the Muslim caravans and thus start a war with Saladin. And I should point out that the film Saladin is more historically accurate on this score. If there is a political message here, it reminds me of nothing more than, dare I say it, President Bush conferring with Donald Rumsfeld to find WMDs in Iraq. If Muslims should perchance be offended by their portrayal in this film, then even more cause have Christians to be piously cantankerous. Like the Crusades and Saladin, Kingdom of Heaven seems to be a bellwether of the political winds blowing at the time the film was made. Although the film's political sensibilities, as I read them, were on the losing side of the 2004 presidential election, this likely will change if U.S. intervention in the Middle East continues or even expands. Given the film's cautionary tale about fanatical crusaders blinded by their ideology and zealotry, Kingdom of Heaven, for all its historical inaccuracies, may well make a prescient addition to the crusading film canon. Thank you.
Well, I don't have any video clips, but I still want to use the podium because I always wanted to. Never had a captive audience, so. Thanks. I quite enjoyed watching that clip from Salahuddin because talking about continuity problems and authenticity problems, when the film was actually released, there was a major blunder. Salahuddin was shown wearing a wristwatch, which is, talk about clash of civilizations, so they had to actually reshoot a big segment of the movie at a substantial cost. So I'm certainly not here tonight to provide you with the amazing revelation that the entertainment industry, in Hollywood in specific, has been rather unkind in the way it portrays Muslims and Arabs. There's no lack of research or interest on the part of numerous Arab American and Muslim American scholars and organizations regarding the contentious question of how and why Hollywood has continued to relish in the vilification and misrepresentation of Arabs and Muslims. Yet it is worthwhile, I think, to note that of all the racial and religious groups that have had the pleasure of being misrepresented by Hollywood since the invention of film, and there have been many, Arabs and Muslims have had the additional privilege of being there from the very beginning and continuing to be there until the very end, until very recently, where they are still one of the very few groups that attract Hollywood's derision without much concern for political correctness. Interestingly enough, the height of Arab and Muslim vilification in Hollywood was quite possibly on September 10th, 2001, i.e. one day before the terrorist attacks of September 11th. Prior to 9/11, Islam had been casually vilified by Hollywood, much to the chagrin of Muslims and to the nonchalance of everybody else. Muslims and Arabs found themselves consistently in a position of having to defend their faith or excuse it, rather. Most Muslims, it seemed, felt they were backward until proven modern, guilty until proven innocent, terrorists until proven otherwise. And Hollywood was at least in part responsible for that mindset. Now, when the events of 9/11 transpired, they were symbolically the epitome of Hollywood's visual fantasy of how an Islamic terrorist attack would be. Ironically, in fact, I often wonder if the terrorists themselves behind the 9/11 attacks were not inspired by films and televisions and in a horrible twist of fate gleaned the dramatic way in which it was staged from Hollywood. As one would expect, the attacks of 9/11 escalated the impending clash of civilizations between Islam and the West to an all-time high at the political, religious, and community levels. Logic therefore dictates that the film industry, which had been so zealous in its misrepresentation of Islam, would have reacted to the 9/11 attacks in a similar way by stepping up the anti-Muslim sentiment, using the 9/11 attacks as material evidence. Here, we told you so. That's what they were up to. Quite amazingly, and I would say unexpectedly, but typical of Hollywood, as it always surprises us, the reaction was entirely different. All of a sudden, Hollywood became quietly introspective about the events of 9/11, and rather than pointing the finger at Islam, a more mature and sophisticated look at the big picture began to transpire from within the industry. Today, the new buzz in Hollywood is all about telling stories that somehow touch upon the civilizational schism between the West and Islam. Hollywood, it seems, is becoming more compassionate and understanding of Arabs and Muslims than one would have thought possible one day or days prior to September 11th. Muslims and Arabs have traditionally lamented the way Hollywood has vilified them, saying that this has contributed to their marginalization and from society and exclusion from the democratic process, while decreasing their sense of self-worth and self-esteem. And therefore, it came as a welcome development that 3.5 years after 9/11, there's an increasing number of Hollywood filmmakers who are intellectually trying to break away from the classic mold of negatively depicting Islam and Muslims. In our line of work, the company that I work for, and me personally, as a localization, authenticity, and cultural consultancy company serving filmmakers, we're effectively the barometer of how Hollywood is changing in the way it deals with this sort of last bastion of culturally accepted racism of an ethnic or racial or religious group. And only a few years ago, our attempts to promote our services to the major Hollywood studios largely fell on deaf ears. Today, it seems that Hollywood can't seem to get enough of us. Filmmakers are stopping and questioning the fairness of how they had previously depicted Islam and Muslims. So in my presentation, I would like to share with you some of the ways that we're working with Hollywood filmmakers in their attempts to redress past misrepresentation of Muslims and their newfound interest in telling more responsible stories. That Hollywood is changing is a wonderful development. However, why Hollywood is reacting in that unexpected way is perhaps a matter for a different discussion. Tonight may not be the most appropriate forum for it. But to the lay filmmaker in Hollywood today, the director, the producer, the writer, the place that Islamic and Arab culture occupy in the landscape of their craft is a very murky area that most would choose not to touch upon. However, if they needed to represent Islam on film, on screen, the toolkit to do so is very well defined, prepackaged, and there. There's a whole library of modules of images, characters, plots about Muslims and Arabs that all you need to do is just add water for it to work in a cinematic context. So it's all there. I personally doubt very much that the average filmmaker is part of a major malicious plot to berate Islam, as many Muslim conspiracy theorists would contend. What is more likely is that these filmmakers have more or less inherited a wholesale, well-defined, and rarely questioned paradigm of how Islam and Muslims are perceived and hence should be represented on screen. And if I can briefly attempt to outline, I mean, the history guys are there. They did a great job. But if I can just briefly outline how that came to be from a Hollywood context, the paradigm would look something like this. It all started with the whole genesis of Islam versus Christianity. I would guess started with the Crusades, or that infamous period of the history of those two great religions when their paths crossed to the detriment of both. The mutual hatred and contempt between both these religions that emanated during that part of history continued to fester through time, gaining further momentum during the age of European colonialism, which John touched upon, of the predominantly Muslim countries. Things didn't get much better during the modern post-independence phase of these Arab and Muslim countries, with the creation of Israel in the second part of the 20th century, which was perceived by many Muslims as a cynical Western plot to continue domination of their hinterland by proxy. So the counter-reaction in the Islamic cultures to the perceived hegemony of the West manifested itself in multiple wars with Israel, the 1970s oil crisis with the West, and most recently in the fundamentalist turn, so to speak, that is afflicting political Islam, which is the turn that is perceived as the only way to counter the aggressive onslaught of the West within these sectors. Therefore, whenever a Hollywood filmmaker dares to be introspective about depicting Islam, they're most probably consciously or not justifying it intellectually using that paradigm. And perhaps it's been an unspoken agreement within the intellectual circles of Hollywood up until very recently that Islam is inherently a radical, barbaric, often violent religion that is bent on the destruction of liberal, forward-thinking, and progressively Western way of life. Proof of that is Islam's alleged oppression of women, its attitudes to art, homosexuality, personal freedoms. Muslims, it is perceived, are themselves bitter at their own cultural and civilizational failure and continue to be driven by fanatic and often militant ideologies, quote unquote. So it is therefore even more remarkable that the events of 9/11 did not lend momentum to the further vilification of Islam and Muslims in Hollywood. So let's examine how this traditional and this transitional phase of deconstructing an age-old paradigm on the part of Hollywood is manifesting itself today, practically, in steps that filmmakers are employing in their craft. The first thing to consider is the sheer increase in volume of films that are currently being produced or are at the cusp of release that deal with the relationship of Islam and the West. Ridley Scott, being the extremely astute filmmaker, which I respect him very much, he naturally chose to start at the very root of the paradigm, with the Kingdom of Heaven taking a renewed look at the basis of the cultural conflict between Islam and Christianity, Islam and the West. And by all accounts, both Ridley Scott and William Monahan, the writer of Kingdom of Heaven, have gone over and beyond the call of duty to make sure that their depiction of Islam and Muslim characters was at least accurate from a cinematic perspective. At this very moment, we as a company are involved with at least 7 different films at varying stages of production that are in some manner dealing with Islam and Muslims, which is a phenomenal volume of films compared to the past. So beyond the actual increase in volume of representing Islam, one of the main areas that we are working with filmmakers today and producers on is a general concern for authenticity. The Egyptian-born actor Omar al-Sharif was once quoted as saying, "I don't mind playing a villain on screen so long as it's an authentic villain." So in a recent audience research study that we conducted in the Middle East regarding a forthcoming Warner Brothers film, there's a scene that depicts a very violent-looking person who is obviously Muslim. And we've conducted an audience research in some Arab and Muslim countries. And to our surprise, the fact that he was visibly Muslim and visibly evil didn't seem to concern a lot of people, and the only thing that they were concerned about was that he was depicted as an Egyptian, although he sounded like a Lebanese. So authenticity is important, and I'm happy to say that Hollywood is getting back to basics as far as that is concerned. The importance of accurately representing images, icons, and physical attributes of a culture on a screen cannot be overstated. I think there is nothing more insulting to an audience than a filmmaker who takes on the privilege of trying to represent their culture or their faith, but failing to undertake the sufficient research to make sure that the depiction is at least authentic. In that respect, we work with set designers, costume designers, makeup artists, art designers, and of course, script writers, directors, producers of Hollywood films, to ensure that every aspect of their depiction of Islam and Arabic culture is represented faithfully. Not surprisingly, the collective institutional memory of Hollywood in that department is extremely faint. And we find ourselves breaking new ground every day. Today, we're practically laying the foundation of creating an encyclopedic body of knowledge that can be used by filmmakers in the future when attempting to portray Arabs and Muslims on screen. In most cases, we commence work on a project after the initial draft of a script has been completed by a writer. Producers are often very weary of infringing on the creative space of writers and prefer to involve us once a cohesive version of the script is available. So we're not really allowed to start talking to the writer until a first draft has been cut. But once that happens, we often have the responsibility of doing a universal review of the script, basically making sure that all the cultural, linguistic, religious, and other aspects are intact. Beyond that, we actually also get involved on the production level. We deploy cultural consultants and authenticity and religious experts on the set of a film to work directly with the director, with the screenwriter if he's involved with the crew, and of course with the other departments that I just mentioned, the art departments, the makeup, costumes, etc. And often we continue working with studios at the production level, at the post-production level, sorry. So that part is the easy part, working with filmmakers to ensure that the tangible audiovisual elements of the film are accurate. What's more tricky and more complex is depicting the emotional, spiritual, religious, and ideological aspects of a religion, the more amorphous parts of a religion. Islam is really the youngest of the three major monotheistic faiths and is most prolific in young, emerging, and developing societies. It is also a faith that relies heavily on individual interpretation of the faith. Most Muslims themselves continue to grapple with, on a daily basis, to better understand how their faith applies to their daily life. And for that reason, it's often difficult for a filmmaker to contend with these issues, given the paradigm that I described earlier, which is usually based on anecdotal or folkloric information that is invariably inflammatory or not really accurate. So that's one challenge. However, the newly enlightened Hollywood filmmakers interested in depicting Islam are today seeking our assistance in understanding these often gray areas of Islamic ideology, from very simple questions, which to many Muslims may be taken for granted, to far more complex ones. And if I can boil down these four major contentious questions that sort of hover over the question of Islam as depicted on screen, the first would be, what is jihad? And does it really call for the destruction of other religions? 2, is Islam an inherently violent religion, thereby justifying terrorism? 3, is Islam oppressive to women? And 4, is Islam a socially repressive religion, and what are its attitudes to personal freedom, human rights, democracy, and freedom of expression? Now, the youthfulness of Islam categorically means that it's still a religion that is progressing and grappling with its place in the modern world. One of the strongest aspects of Islam historically was that it was a faith that required its believers to connect directly with the divine rather than by proxy through an intermediary caste of clergy. Unfortunately, Muslims had previously been encouraged to engage in what is known as ijtihad, which is different from jihad. And ijtihad is basically the practice of attempting to understand one's faith by personal interpretation and innovation. Now, unfortunately, at some time in the history of Islam, probably at the 10th or 11th century, the religious scholars decided that it was time to close this door of innovation because all the major questions had been answered and basically prevented people from interpreting their religion directly and connecting with God directly. So I personally believe that the future of Islam as a modern, vibrant, and well-integrated religion lies in the reopening of the doors of innovation for this great faith to find a comfortable place for itself between the modern world and the basis of the religion. There's one more point that I'd like to raise about the role that we play. It's very important. We often get asked about this, and it's very important to note that under no circumstances do we perceive ourselves as a public relations machine bent on improving the image of Islam or any other religion, because we don't actually work just with Islam. We're a cultural, religious consultancy firm in all the major faiths. We're certainly not intent on being apologists for Islam, or do we attempt to restore the reality of the faith by glossing over its more controversial aspects. However, it's important to understand that Islam has been so misrepresented in the entertainment industry that simply representing it accurately will be a paramount improvement. And finally, we need to ask why it is important to ensure that Hollywood does not distort the reality of Muslims and Islam and to attempt to deliver honest and accurate stories. The most obvious answer to my mind is that vilification of an entire group is not conducive to building cohesive, peaceful, democratic, and harmonious societies. The power of film as a medium essentially means that generations upon generations rely primarily on the entertainment industry as their #1 source of information and the shaper of their worldviews and value systems. By continuing to damage or defame individuals belonging to a specific faith or ethnic or cultural group, Hollywood or the entertainment industry at large is playing a part that I do not believe it was ever intended to play. Films entertain us, they help us dream, hope, and aspire. They capture a cultural snapshot of our societies. Films reflect our realities, fantasies, and imagination, and essentially help us grow and actualize our potential. These wonderful attributes of this amazing industry should not be exclusive to one ethnic, cultural, religious group or the other, but should be free for all, especially so in this great country. Thank you.
Thank you, panel. And I'm wondering if anybody in there would like to start with a question or comment to any or all. Lynn?
Since we started off the presentation with the Kingdom of Heaven, I wonder if you, since you have been involved with the production, can assess whether you feel like they would be fairly criticized for their portrayal of Islam or Muslims in the film, or whether their attempt was successful in being balanced or not.
Unfortunately, the studio has a universal gag order on what we can say or we can't say, but I can tell you that in most cases, no one is going to be happy and everybody's going to be mad. You just can't win. Regardless of how the movie depicts Islam, I'm almost certain that there will be some zealous group or some person who will find fault at how the movie has represented Islam, and likewise in Christianity. I certainly don't think either Ridley Scott or the writer set out to please one religion or the other. I do believe that they set out on telling a story, not necessarily 100% based on fact, but definitely set out on telling a story and in the process attempting to be authentic to the various religions. Whether or not the members of these different faiths will be happy about the outcome is, I think we'll find out on May 7th. So.
Yes? You?
Talk a lot about Hollywood as movies, and there's a close cousin in the entertainment industry, which is the video game and computer game industry. It tends to be less studied by academia. It tends to be perhaps more adversarial than movies, if possible. Wondering if, from each of your perspectives, do you have any comments on how that aspect of the industry is treating either Arabs or Islam?
Sure. I think it'll follow the money. Hollywood is a major industry now and have sufficient funds to, both sufficient funds and to be sufficiently in the limelight to attract criticism. I completely agree with you that the video game industry is sort of the next big realm of cultural influence. And once there is sufficient research on how that impacts society and sufficient social responsibility on the part of the video game makers, that eventually they'll reach out. But I think the entertainment industry, film industry, so to speak, the lines between the video game industry and the film industry are being increasingly blurred. And at some point, there'll be a lot of commonalities between both, and we may not have to view them as different entities.
Stephen?
Yeah, my question is for the last speaker. The last question asked about the video game industry in relation to depiction of religion or adversaries in that. My question is kind of parallel. It has to do with television. It seems to me that this audience, Hollywood now is global in its scope. When you make a film, you automatically assume there will be an international distribution for it, and whether an audience, a film like this finds an audience in the Muslim world may depend in part on how it depicts people of that tradition. But television is produced for domestic consumption. It may get syndicated abroad. I'm thinking in particular of a show that I've been watching with my children through this season and last season, which is 24, in which Kiefer Sutherland this year is saving the world again from the attacks of the evil Muslim terrorist who is fanatically driven by his religious faith. His name is Marwan, And he's already killed dozens or hundreds of people and is now seeking to blow up nuclear power plants. Last year, they averted a nuclear strike over Los Angeles. And this is all, again, the man who they pass on the suitcase with the nuclear bomb, and they meet in the hangar of the airport to take the plane up into the air to drop the bomb on L.A., and they say, Allahu Akbar. And so I wonder if you've been consulted by Hollywood with regard to film production, whether anybody from television has approached you, or whether, have you seen this show? Do you have any response to that?
I have. I've seen the show. Sorry,
first question is asking why you're seeing that show with your kids. Okay, you're excused.
But in response to the first part of your question, I think U.S.-produced television is widely distributed in the world. You see all the major network shows in most parts of the Arab world, in Asia Pacific, and Europe. So it may not be as widely prolific as Hollywood movies, but it's getting there. Now, whether we have been consulted by television producers or television production companies, no. But we are actually actively pursuing them. And I have to say that there's been they're not as responsive or as interested in the concept of authenticity and basically representing Islam and Arabs in a positive, no, I wouldn't say positive, but in an accurate light. Not as much as Hollywood, but we're certainly getting to them. We're certainly pursuing them.
Yes.
To prepare for your panel, I spent some time surfing the net today, and I was astonished to find what I did, and I want to share a little bit with you and ask you whether you're familiar with this. When you enter Ridley Scott's Kingdom of Heaven, the second website you could pull up, and the rest of us too, and we would read, Ridley Scott's New Crusades film panders to Osama bin Laden by a Charlotte Edward. Ridley Scott, the Oscar-nominated director, was savaged by senior British academics last night over his forthcoming film, which they say distorts the history of the Crusades to portray Arabs in a favorable light. The £75 million film is fascinating, is described by the makers as being historically accurate and designed to be a fascinating history lesson. Academics, however, including Professor Jonathan Ridley Smith, Britain's leading authority on the Crusades, attacks the plot of Kingdom of Heaven, describing it as rubbish, ridiculous, complete fiction, and dangerous to Arab relations. And I've taken a couple minutes, so I'll conclude with one final statement. Ridley Scott was following both Saddam Hussein and Hafez Assad, the former Syrian dictator. Both leaders commissioned huge portraits and statues of Saladin, who was actually a Sunni Kurd, not an Arab. To bolster Arab-Muslim pride, Sir Ridley's efforts were misguided and pandered to Islamic fundamentalism, quote unquote. It's Osama bin Laden's version of history. It will fuel the Islamic fundamentalists. Wow.
I know Jonathan Riley Smith, and I find it hard to believe he'd actually say that, but without seeing the film. So I rather question that side.
I think they screened it.
And if you were at the NCAA tournament, you would have seen it.
Oh, okay. So it was screened?
Screened in Britain.
Yeah. But having read the screenplay, I find it hard to believe that it's inflammatory for the Muslims, because I think it...
He didn't say inflammatory for the Muslims.
The opposite.
Fundamentalism, which is a distortion of the Islamic religion.
Yeah, I guess the possibility there is that it's too secularized. It portrays Saladin as basically not very religious, that the religion is really left to a mullah who's not present very often. on the screen. So perhaps it might be upsetting to very religious Muslims, just as Saladin would have been very offensive from that point of view as well.
May I interject something? I'm reading what I think I heard you say differently.
Yeah.
I'm reading it that the portrayal is of fundamentalist Crusader Christians that adds ammunition to the position of the reactionary Muslims. Is that
That's what
right?
I understood, yeah.
So that gives in other words, the portrayal is the negative portrayal of Christianity is the conquistadore, the crusader, the imperialist that will add fuel to Osama's position of the West as being exploitative. So that's how I'm reading it.
But the interesting thing is that everybody has something to be angry about in the movie. I mean, I have an article here from the Herald of Glasgow that talks about a screening of the movie to British academics, and they quote Khaled Abu El Fadl at UCLA, who says that this movie is going to spark hate crimes against Muslims because it's so inflammatory in its depiction of Islam. So it sounds as if there's plenty of distress to go around.
I would suspect that the Jewish community would probably be very happy about the portrayal of the Jews.
I don't think they're depicted in it. Yes.
Maybe like sometimes this controversy is like built up, it's kind of spun up in order to sell more movie tickets. They try and show different newspapers that say like, oh, it's against the Arabs, oh, it's against the Christians or whatever, just so that they can, like the Passion of Christ, for example.
Well, I think it's rather surprising to me that this sort of inflammatory rhetoric is coming from academics, but maybe not, I don't know. But I think that, you have to look at it in perspective, and certainly if you look at past Crusade films, they could be taken as just as inflammatory. Certainly the Crusades is far more inflammatory, I think, than Kingdom of Heaven will be. That was made in 1935. It starts out, the opening scene is of Muslims tearing down the cross on the Holy Sepulchre, then throwing icons, holy books, the wood of the true cross onto a great bonfire. And then it shows women, Christian women, being sold as slaves to a lot of ugly old Arab men. So I very much doubt that it will, approach that level.
I also think, from what I've heard about the film, and you may have a stronger idea than I do, that the filmmakers have gone out of their way not to make this controversial. I mean, they've tried to depict Christians and Muslims as getting along and finding common cause. And they've also really tried to discourage a negative campaign. I think that's part of the reason why they've tamped down the publicity. They don't want the kind of Passion of the Christ inflammatory religious publicity.
Well, I've heard of paranormal activities on the set of The Ring too. That wasn't a good movie.
Yeah, yes?
I'm interested in the discussion that concluded with regards to authenticity. This goes to the whole panel. Taking the position that this art form is a reflective of society. Fanaticism does exist. It's on the rise. Fundamentalism is on the rise. It's pandemic in religions right now. And whether it's portraying a Reverend Phelps or some other, is it inauthentic to portray fanaticism, or is it simply taking a character that's an easy mark and maybe sexier because it's quicker from a filmmaker's perspective? It doesn't require too much subtlety. I think you said, you don't really see this conspiracy going on, but could it be as simple as that the filmmakers really just don't respect audiences enough to think that they'll be able to understand anything with any kind of depth? And they're taking a sexy target like a fundamentalist who's a fanatic, or a group of fundamentalists that are fanatics, and trying to explain
So the problem with Islam is that not so much that it's depicting a realistic and actual facet of it, which is fundamentalism. And there's no denying that, as you aptly put it, fundamentalism is a problem with all the major faiths. The problem prior to all of this with Islam is that this was the only segment of the religion or the culture that was focused on. And that was basically what Hollywood was zeroing in on for various reasons that I mentioned. Now, we're in a very tricky situation today because the reality of the fact is that the relationship of Islam and the West, as depicted in politicized Islam, is very fanatical. Whether filmmakers, storytellers, directors should choose to incorporate that or not is a matter left to their own creative prerogative. The question that I think is significant is to depict that in a larger, honest context. I don't mind that fundamentalists and terrorists are depicted it, because they are part of our reality. But to do that within a larger, comprehensive framework and to show other facets of the religion and not just focus on that.
I think that this might be a good time to end. We have a lovely reception upstairs that people are invited to. I think the panel may stay a little bit longer if you want to come ask some questions. And I want to thank you and thank you all for being part of this.